Leo Strauss, Natural Right and History, an examination of the crisis of modernity and the foundations of political philosophy. Leo Strauss, 1899 to 1973, a German-American political philosopher, is most famous for his revival of classical political philosophy and his critique of modernity. His seminal 1953 book, Natural Right and History, based on his Walgreen lectures at the University of Chicago, represents one of the most influential mid-20th century reflections on the foundations of political thought. In this work, Strauss seeks to rescue the idea of natural right from the relativism of historicism and positivism, arguing that philosophy, and especially political philosophy, must recover its classical roots to guide human life and civic order. The crisis of modernity. Strauss begins Natural Right and History by diagnosing a deep crisis in contemporary thought, the abandonment of reason as a guide for life and politics. In his view, modern social science, particularly in its historicist and positivist forms, has turned away from the search for what is truly good or just. Instead, it focuses on facts, historical developments, or subjective preferences. This shift, Strauss argues, has resulted in a moral relativism that undermines the very possibility of objective standards of justice or right. For Strauss, the heart of the crisis is the rejection of natural right, the idea that there is a right by nature, valid for all humans at all times. Historicism claims that all values are historically contingent, shaped by their cultural or temporal contexts. Positivism, especially in its scientific variant, insists that values are not knowable in any objective sense. Only empirical facts are accessible to human knowledge. Both approaches deny that reason can discover universal moral truths. This intellectual environment, Strauss claims, has devastating consequences for political life. Without any rational standard of right, politics becomes either the manipulation of public opinion or the exercise of arbitrary will. Liberal democracy, in particular, is left intellectually defenseless against tyranny, precisely because it can no longer assert the superiority of its principles over competing regimes. The problem of natural right. In response to this crisis, Strauss proposes a return to the classical concept of natural right. He distinguishes between natural right and natural law, though the two are closely related. Natural right, as Strauss develops it, refers to a rational standard of justice discoverable through philosophical inquiry. It is not based on divine command or historical convention, but on the nature of human beings and the structure of the world. Strauss insists that the idea of natural right must be approached historically as well as philosophically. He provides a critical survey of different conceptions of natural right, from the classical Greek tradition to the modern Enlightenment. He argues that the classical view, especially as developed by Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, understands natural right as grounded in a teleological view of nature. That is, nature has purposes or ends, and human beings, as rational creatures, have a natural function or telos, end, which determines the proper order of human life and society. Classical natural right. Strauss holds up Aristotle as the exemplar of classical natural right. According to Aristotle, human beings are by nature political animals. They achieve their highest good within the polis, city-state. Justice, for Aristotle, is a matter of giving each person his due, in accordance with their nature and function. This presupposes a hierarchical order in which the best should rule and excellence, virtue, is rewarded. Natural right in this context is flexible but not relative. It recognizes a natural order of things but also adapts to the complexity of human life. The classical view, Strauss argues, affirms that human reason is capable of knowing what is just and unjust. However, it also acknowledges the limits of human understanding and the necessity of prudence. Natural right does not always provide exact formulas, but it offers orientation. It tells us what kinds of regimes are better or worse, what kinds of lives are nobler or base. The modern transformation. Strauss devotes significant attention to how modern thinkers transform the classical notion of natural right. He focuses particularly on Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. These thinkers, in his view, redefined natural right in terms of individual self-preservation and subjective desire, rather than the fulfillment of a human nature ordered toward virtue. Thomas Hobbes, for example, identifies natural right with the right of self-preservation. For Hobbes, there is no objective moral order in nature, only the natural passions and the struggle for survival. The state arises not to cultivate virtue, but to prevent violent death. This shift is radical. It rejects the idea that reason can guide us toward a moral purpose, and instead makes fear and desire the foundation of political order. Strauss argues that modern natural right replaces the question, what is the good life, with, how can we secure peace and comfort? In doing so, it ultimately undermines the dignity of politics and philosophy. While early modernity retains some vestiges of natural law, Strauss believes that its inner logic leads to relativism and nihilism. Historicism and positivism. Strauss devotes considerable attention to two intellectual currents that dominate 20th century social science: historicism and positivism. Historicism, the belief that all values are relative to their historical context, denies the existence of eternal truths. It claims that every moral or political system must be understood in terms of the time and place in which it emerged. The danger here, according to Strauss, is that we lose the capacity to judge other cultures or regimes. We cannot, for example, say that tyranny is worse than democracy, only that they are different. Positivism, on the other hand, holds that only empirical facts are meaningful, and that moral judgments are mere expressions of feeling. In rejecting metaphysics, positivism claims to be value-free, but Strauss contends that it smuggles in its own preferences under the guise of neutrality. Positivism leaves us without any grounds for defending justice, freedom, or human dignity. In both cases, Strauss sees a retreat from the Socratic tradition, the belief that rational inquiry into the good is possible and necessary. Natural right in history seeks to restore that tradition by challenging the intellectual dogmas of the modern academy. The return to classical political philosophy. Strauss calls for a return to classical political philosophy, not as a nostalgic exercise, but as a living possibility. He encourages readers to take the ancients seriously, not just as historical figures, but as thinkers who can still teach us about the human condition. This requires what Strauss calls an open-minded return to the texts of Plato, Aristotle, and others, and a willingness to engage their arguments on their own terms. For Strauss, this return is not a matter of blind imitation. He recognizes the achievements of modern thought, including its concern for individual rights and scientific progress. However, he insists that these achievements must be grounded in a rational understanding of human nature and moral truth. Otherwise, they are fragile and easily corrupted. One of Strauss's central themes is the distinction between the ancients and the moderns in their understanding of natural right. The ancients, he argues, saw philosophy as a way of life, oriented toward the cultivation of the soul and the pursuit of wisdom. The moderns, in contrast, see philosophy as a tool for mastering nature and improving material conditions. Strauss believes this shift has impoverished our moral and political imagination. Legacy and criticism. Natural right in history has had a profound influence on political theory, especially in the United States. Strauss helped revive interest in classical texts and encouraged a new generation of scholars to explore the moral foundations of political life. His students and followers, such as Alan Bloom, Harvey Mansfield, and Harry Jaffa, carried forward his project in different directions. However, Strauss's work has also faced criticism. Some accuse him of elitism, esotericism, or an overly nostalgic view of antiquity. Others argue that his critique of modernity is too sweeping and fails to account for its genuine advances in liberty and equality. Still, even his critics acknowledge the power and rigor of his thought. Conclusion. In Natural Right and History, Leo Strauss offers a penetrating critique of modern social science and a compelling case for the revival of classical political philosophy. By defending the possibility of natural right, he challenges the intellectual relativism of his time and affirms the capacity of reason to guide human life. His work remains a touchstone for anyone interested in the perennial questions of justice, virtue, and the good society. Strauss's call to return to the sources of Western philosophy is not simply academic. It is a political and moral imperative. In a world increasingly skeptical of truth and reason, Natural Right in History reminds us that the quest for justice is both possible and necessary.